This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Write On, showcasing the work of Otago Southland writers. I'm Beverly Martens. Join me for news and interviews with local writers on the second Wednesday of every month from noon till 1 and replayed the following Sunday at 1 p.m. Write On is brought to you by the Otago Southland branch of the New Zealand Society of Authors and kindly supported by the great team at the University Bookshop.
What do you want to be when you grow up? They say you are what you read, and the University Bookshop can help you be whoever you want to be. Do you want to be an athlete? Then sit down with an inspiring sports biography. Do you fancy yourself as a detective? We have a grisly lineup of murder mysteries waiting just for you. Do you aspire to be the world's greatest chef? We have cookbooks to tantalise your taste buds. Do you want to celebrate your inner child? Play up in our fabulous children's room. The University Bookshop, helping you decide what you want to be when you grow up.
Hello and welcome to the March edition of Write On, brought to you by the Otago Southland branch of the Society of Authors and the great team at the University Bookshop. Well, this month it's all about fellowship, both in the literal sense because my first guest is the 2025 Burns Fellow Dr. Octavia Cade, and then later in the show in the more general sense when we reflect on 40 years of the fellowship amongst the Otago poets, the great long list of them who have all been involved in the either organising or reading at the Octagon Poetry Collective, which still has ongoing monthly meetings to this day. So first up, it's a very warm southern welcome to this year's Burns Fellow Octavia Cade, who slipped back into Dunedin in January and has been diligently working away ever since. Welcome, Octavia, but this is not your first time in Dunedin, is it?
No, it isn't. Just first, thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here. Lovely to be back in Dunedin. I went to university here, actually. I did natural sciences, looking at mostly botany and sort of marine science, and then I ended up doing my PhD in science communication here. And
what all did that involve?
Well, to be honest, it was a change that I didn't quite expect. Because when I was a little girl, I didn't think, I'm going to grow up to be a writer. I enjoyed science fiction and I read a lot of it because my parents were both big fans, and they both made sure that me and my sister had, plenty of exposure to science fiction, both Doctor Who and Star Trek and all those things. But I thought I would grow up to be a scientist. My dad was a scientist. He's a marine biologist.
Right. And
I thought that sounded quite good. Not so much the fish part. I could, take or leave the fish. And so I'd planned to be a scientist, and I got to university and I started doing all the science courses, and then I came up against the literary horror that is the scientific paper.
You mean that you need a dictionary to wade yourself through it, or
not just the dictionary? It sucked all the fun out of science for me. It really did. I think it's a terrible way of communicating science for most people. And I think when you go into university as a science student, and people who aren't science students don't know this, you do your labs every week for every paper, and pretty much in every paper every week you have to write a lab report, which is a sort of mini example of the scientific paper, introduction, methods, results, conclusions, whatever. And you have to be your writing has to be so dry, so grim. I remember there being quite a small stir at one point when the New Zealand Journal of Botany, I think it was, decided that in your method section you could say, I did this, rather than this was done.
So it's like the difference between active and passive writing.
Yes. All the writing is extraordinarily passive, and because we are trained to talk about science in this way, we never actually end up learning to talk about it in a way that non-scientists can relate to. The further you get in science, the more specific your language is, and the more cut off you become, I think, from not only scientists outside your field, but the general public.
So that would kind of kill your passion, or it's then hard to share and embrace your passion because you're always kind of behind glass, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I love science. I did not enjoy writing lab reports. I did not enjoy, doing all and seeing all these exciting, wonderful things, field trips out on the peninsula and so on, and then having to come back and talk about it in a way that sucked.
Yeah, sort of diminished it almost. Yeah,
it did. And so I was sort of at the point of no return there, and then the science communication program started up.
Yes, which was quite groundbreaking.
It was.
Yeah. So that was great timing for you, was it?
It was really good timing, and I thought, well, I'll go and do that. And it was really exciting because I got to talk about science in ways that excited me. I got to talk about it with, normal people who also really like science. And I think that is the sad and the wonderful bit about science, performing science as a scientist. Everyone around you is so interested in what you do, but there are so few avenues for them to really engage with it. I mean, what do? Do you hand them your latest paper and watch as their eyes glaze over within 2 paragraphs?
Right, you're talking about the general public, not your peers, but yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Even your peers' papers are boring. I'm sorry, they are. You chat with them at the pub or, over coffee and they're so excited about what they're doing.
And it comes alive and then it kind of gets...
And then it dies on paper.
On the page. Oh, that's really interesting.
And I understand, that scientific papers, the purpose of them is to condense all that information down into a form that other scientists working in that field can easily understand. But it really blocks out everyone else.
Mm. So luckily, perfect timing, and you were saved, and we got to now experience your work in a brilliant way. So you did the science communication thing, and that's really when you started to with speculative fiction and the climate change writing, or cli-fi is the the hip term for it. Was that always in your mind, or did that come about through that?
Not really, no. As I said, I grew up as a science fiction fan. I've always been mad on it, and I started writing little short stories as a sort of a hobby, and they weren't very good. I sold a small amount, but when I started writing them, I was, that advice, write what you know. Mm-hmm. I wasn't doing that. I was writing, these very average stories about very typical sort of science fiction and fantasy.
And probably quite derivative if you think about it. Because
extremely derivative things.
From things that you'd seen on telly.
Writing like very boring vampire stories and stuff like that. And when I started to have some success in the short stories was when I started writing science into them, science fiction stories. Mostly ecological stories, because, that was my background. Mm-hmm. And so when I started writing about plants and ecology and folding that into my science fiction stories, that was when they began to sort of really start to sell.
And that meant that you could claim a space that was unique to you, because you were combining your two,
yes,
your old passions with your new kind of craft.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, there are a lot of science fiction writers who started out as scientists. I don't know if you read The Three-Body Problem.
No.
I think the author there was a computer engineer first. A lot of the authors come from very strong physical sciences background, from physics and chemistry and engineering. I don't know if people read a lot of hard science fiction. That is often a lot of where the writing engineers go, because they can talk about, sprockets to their heart's content for pages at a time.
World building.
Yeah. But it's sort of slightly different when you're talking about biology, because you have that space to explore how people react to biology and to ecology, because, with the best will in the world, there are a lot of people going throughout their daily lives who don't have strong opinions about sprockets. But, they walk on the beach, they live through weather events with the rest of us.
I was just going to say that.
It's a lot more accessible, I think.
And I think biology is always part of, a good childhood, isn't it? Because you are out exploring in the field, whether it's, your backyard or it's sort of day trips or camps or those kinds of things that you interact with biology a lot more. And also, people have pets, so that's part of that too, isn't it?
I mean, my sister and I were at the beach a lot as kids, messing about in the rock pools. And we had a big gum tree outside the house with those big gum caterpillars that, he ended up in the ice cream containers with all the gum leaves as we fed them and watched them.
And the little holes poked in the top.
Yeah.
Look, I found the area that you write in is not an area that I normally read, but I found your writing so original, and we should just mention a couple of your more well-known works. One is a novella called The Stone Wetter, and the other is a great book of short stories called You Are My Sunshine. And I've only read the title story in that and found it equally intriguing, disturbing, and kind of plausible and kind of, I think you used the word bonkers, but great. But I wanted to, just wanted to give listeners a lovely example of how you've managed to sort of marry the two things, because in The Stone Wetter, you have a little factoid about each of the character creatures, because actually it's the creatures that carry that story, don't they? In a way, like the creatures are the characters, if that makes sense. People would have to read it, but there's, to get what I mean, but there's a little factoid at the start of each different character. And, for example, with The Stone Wetter itself, when the world freezes around it, becoming a stretch of snow and ice and darkness, the stone wetter freezes solid in its bolt hole. Over 80% of the water in its body turns to ice. The wetter is climate in a single body. It is a continent broken off, geology made flesh. Wow. So that just made me want to keep reading, even though you were giving me the science. I love that. So how long did it take you to craft those things? Does that come quite naturally to you, or?
It does, because like most writers, I think, I keep a folder of story ideas. And a lot of my story ideas comes from weird science. I'm always looking up YouTube videos and science news articles about these weird little creatures from around the world. And so whenever I see something particularly odd or particularly repulsive, I think, oh, let's write about that. And it goes straight into my ideas folder. And I love the idea of working with the wetter because it's such a New Zealand species. And the stone wetter is an actual creature. It lives in central Otago. In the Rock and Pillar Range,
which you've been to, presumably. This is part of your field trips, is it? Or
no, it wasn't actually.
God, it made me believe you had.
Yeah. And I just find it fascinating. What a way to deal with winter. There were times, in the botany classes at Otago when I'd look outside and see this horizontal snow as it blew through the university. And, the thought of that sort of very cryogenic hibernation throughout winter has its appeal. It
definitely does, yeah. For us, it's just all about putting on yet another layer of merino or possum if things get really bad. Also, I thought was really interesting in You Are My Sunshine, and I don't want to give away the plot of that fabulous short story, but you also had a really interesting point in there where two scientists are coming at something from a different angle, where one of them is trying to save a particular sort of sea starfish, and yet another one's going, well, I don't bloody care about them because they killed the coral in the reef in Australia. So I thought was really interesting, is that scientists can be in conflict about the very thing they're trying to save.
It's not quite the same species there. It's two different species, but the person who hates the starfish is quite mentally unstable at this point because she's been working on the Great Barrier Reef all her life and it's died.
Yes,
and part of the contributing factor to that is this particular starfish, which is called the crown of thorns starfish. They like warm waters, and so as the waters around the reef get warmer and warmer, they migrate south and they eat everything.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a sort of, one thriving, one not surviving.
And so when this particular scientist is talking to the second one, who is working on this North Pacific sunflower sea star, which is one of the largest starfish in the world, it's, about a metre across. And the thing about that poor starfish is its population at the moment is plummeting due to what is called the zombie starfish syndrome. And when it gets this thing, its arms sort of fall off and they keep moving for a while, like little zombie starfish arms, and then the whole thing sort of disintegrates and dies.
Yeah. So, listeners, I urge you to look this story up. Because I don't think we should say any more about it, because even more crazy things happen in the parameter of the story. But it is really interesting.
Yeah, both these starfish, I would point out, came from my weird, disgusting animal facts folder.
Right, there you go. It made for. I mean, I can't stop thinking about some of the visual images in that story. So that's a job well done, Octavia. Now let's talk about your Burns projects. Actually, let's talk about the fellowship in general. What does that mean to you, getting it?
Oh, it's incredible.
Yeah.
It's always been on my bucket list of things to achieve as a writer, but I honestly thought it would probably be about 5 or 10 years away for me. So I've been applying for, several years for the Burns, and because I never expect to get it, I sort of basically keep applying out of practice, and to suddenly have it, to be given the Burns.
It sort of shocked? You were a little bit shocked?
Yes. Really delighted. I mean, when Lynn from the English department left a message on my phone saying, here I'm calling from, Otago's English department. Would you please call me back? I thought, I knew what it was, but I couldn't make myself believe it until I actually talked to her. I thought, surely not.
Fantastic. But actually, you have had, let's talk about applying for residencies and fellowships, because you've had a good run lately in that in the last few years, in that you've had the Michael King residency, the Ursula Bethel residency, a residency at Massey, just to name and a couple more as well. Now that looks like luck, but I know it's not.
It is absolutely not luck.
Yeah. So let's talk about your approach to applying for grants and residencies.
Yeah, I think you can probably add the Creative New Zealand Arts Grant there too, which I was very grateful for and very glad to have. So I always say thank you for that. It is, I suppose it is kind of a little bit luck, because when you're applying for these things, they very often, I think, have to balance the people they take. I mean, the Burns, you can apply for it with a fiction project, a poetry project, a non-fiction project, or a sort of mashup of any of these. And so, to be fair, I think they probably have to balance it as the years go by. I mean, they think maybe we've
not
had
5 poets in a row kind of thing. Yeah.
I mean, this is obviously just my opinion. They haven't said anything like this to me. So partly it is luck. You might be applying with the best biography project in the world, but if the last 3 residents or grants have gone to biography projects, it may not. It may just be bad luck for you with the timing and things, but more often it's persistence. I was talking to someone yesterday, and he was telling me how several years back he had applied for a Creative New Zealand Arts Grant, and he didn't get it, and he was very disappointed and never applied again. I applied for that thing at least 10 times.
Right. So definitely tenacity, but also because we were talking off air before the interview, there's a tailoring that you do too, which I think can set your thing about. Would you like to sort of expand on that, please?
On my laptop, I have this applications folder, and I have a list of residencies and grants that I would like in my artistic life, and some of them are very far off and some of them are, more doable now. But for each one, for instance, for the Burns, I have a little Burns folder. I have records of each application that I've made over the last however many years I have been applying for the Burns. And if I go back and look at my first applications, they were honestly just not very good. Because, application writing is a skill. Just like any other writing is a skill, you need to practice it. You need to go back and look at it when you don't get something and try and look at it with a very critical eye. And you can say, well, it's just luck, but it isn't. When you see the weaknesses in your own application, it helps you to do better next time. And I think it's really persistence that is the key here. I mean, you gave that little list of residencies and grants that I've had. None of them I got on the first application.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so don't give up is the key message. But also, I know with the Burns and with other residencies, you have tailored it to making them believe that this could only be done in Dunedin or wherever. Like, you bring geography into it in terms of your projects, don't you?
Yeah, well, not all the time, but
you have for this one, though.
I have for this one, and
yeah.
I'm not sure that it's a coincidence that my previous Burns applications had nothing to do with, honestly, nothing too much to do with Otago or even with New Zealand sometimes. You have to, I think, try different things. If your general novel that isn't set particularly anywhere isn't getting anywhere in the grants you're applying to it with, maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe try a different approach. And I knew when I applied for the Burns this time that I wanted to try something very Dunedin-based. Partly because I knew the city and I really like the city, and partly because I spent some time at the Portobello Marine Lab when I was at grad school. So I know the area there quite well. And if you're writing ecological or climate fiction, as I am, the Otago Peninsula and the Otago Harbour has so much scope. I mean, there's the albatross and the penguins and all the interesting
the sea lions,
biological and ecological things we have here. I mean, what a fantastic setting for a story about toxic algal blooms in the Dunedin Harbour. How do they affect these creatures? How does it affect us when we see the albatross and the penguins suffering? I mean,
so this is what's become your project,
yes,
and your research for this year. Or
yes,
part of it. Yeah,
it's certainly become the fiction half of the project. The non-fiction half is sort of tangentially related. I'm looking at how New Zealand science fiction over the years has dealt with ecological invasion, in the same way that I'm looking at the ecological invasion of an algal bloom in my fiction.
That almost sounds like a PhD thesis doing that, is it? Or
it's probably going to be a lot shorter, but
and a lot less dry potentially.
Yes, hopefully, because there is. Of course, I read a lot of New Zealand science fiction, and there has been over decades a very interesting focus on how we deal with that, and it's often a very brutal focus. I mean, right from the Hutu and Kawa picture books in the 1950s. My mum has her old set and she loves them. I said something unflattering once about Hutu and Kawa and she gasped and said it was like slashing Teddy's throat to say terrible things about Hutu and Kawa. But if you read those books, they can be a little cutesy with their chubby little babies and their sort of red Pahuta Kawa skirts, and they're having a birthday party for Grandpa Kiwi with a birthday cake made of worms. And that's all very well and good, but then a possum comes along and it's like, kill that thing. And then we have Under the Mountain by Maurice G., which was one of my favourite books as a kid and which gave me absolute nightmares. But the solution to alien invasion in that book was to have 2 11-year-old children commit genocide.
Right.
And it's like there is a very brutal underpinning of how we deal with invasive species in this country, and it comes out in the speculative fiction that we produce.
And what will you do with that kind of research and knowing all of that? What will that become? Because your first one's going to be a novel.
Yes. Probably a short book. Not
like creative nonfiction?
No, probably more academic,
right.
Just a short sort of academic monograph.
So
really barnbuster that one, but but I have I do tend to write academically on speculative fiction and how we talk about science in science fiction and horror and stuff like that. So this seemed like a good opportunity and to work on it because, you have access to the university library and the university databases, and it's makes research so much easier.
And the Hocken, that's another
Yes.
special thing that we can offer you down here, is to physically for you to go into the
Yes,
Hocken.
Hocken is fantastic.
isn't it?
I've been there
Yeah.
doing research already, and there is a lot there.
Now, just listening to you talk, Octavia, you sound incredibly diligent. Your computer's obviously rammed with file after file after file. How do you kind of keep these things all in your head, because you've got things at different stages of first drafts, research, crafting something, maybe polishing something else over here, sending something away there, applying for a grant there. How do you keep it all in your head, and what do you do to relax and switch off, or is there no off switch with you?
I do not keep it all in my head. If I did that, I would forget all the time. Everything gets written down.
So everything for you is about good filing systems.
Yes, extremely so. My computer is jam-packed with sort of dates where I have to remember things by, and random ideas. I mean, I think every writer, whether they use their laptop or if they have a pen and pad by the side of their bed, when they wake up in the middle of the night with a really good idea, they just jot it down so they don't forget. And it's so useful to do that, because sometimes, you have to write and you're stuck and you have no good ideas. So you've just got to go back to this folder of random possibilities that you've kept up, and it doesn't really matter if it's 4 pages of bullet notes
or a phrase.
Yes.
Yeah. So are you a bit of a workaholic? Do you?
No, I'm quite lazy.
Are you? Oh gosh, you don't give me that impression.
No. The one thing that I particularly find about writing is that I often do find it quite hard to get started every day. And you sit down in front of
the blank
for me,
screen.
it's the blank screen.
Yeah.
Other people, it's the blank page. And
Yeah.
you look at it and you think, maybe I should do the vacuuming. And I hate vacuuming.
but I hate it less than this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I generally find once I get started, it's fine. But I do need coffee and determination to start typing.
Do you have to balance too, a lot of us do, the earning money thing versus the writing? And of course it's always easier to give the attention to the earning money because that's day-to-day life and that's more acceptable in the world, and it just needs to be done to pay the power bill or whatever. Yeah. So these residencies for you are great, or
No.
do you find the structure quite hard in a way that even though you have the space, there's no tension, it's all up to you?
No, they are excellent. The one reason I apply for so many is that, let's be honest, arts does not tend to be a high-paying career, and I would not often take on some of the projects that I try without the financial backing that I get from some residencies. I think
because they're relatively marginal, or
yes, or because there's
they're
something
not
new that I haven't
mainstream
tried, or
sort
because
of romance fiction or anything, are they?
No, but look at this sort of ecological invasion and speculative fiction. Assuming that sells to a publisher, and I will probably submit it to the University of Otago Press, it is not going to be
a blockbuster.
No, it's not going to be remunerative at all. It's not going to get me a lot of money. But these are the interesting projects, and I think sometimes the interesting projects turn out to be the best ones.
Well, I think that gives you the staying power. If you stay interested in it, then you can get to the end of it.
Yes, and I think it also gives you the freedom to try new things. There is something of a trap, I think, when you are a creative person. If you begin to sell in some area and you have a market for this particular thing, there is a temptation to keep producing very similar work because, you do have to pay the power bill and you know that this will sell. And
your publisher knows that it will sell too, so there'll be probably a little bit of pressure from that end as well.
Yeah, and you've got kids to put through school or the mortgage to pay or the rent or whatever, and so it's scary to step outside that and try a different type of creativity, a different genre, a different format. And I think you've got to really try to force yourself to do that. And it's so much easier if you have financial support.
Got food and board covered.
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant.
And that is one of the main advantages of the Burns, indeed of all the arts fellowships at Otago. They give artists breathing space to work on.
And a decent length of, they could be a year, which is probably the longest one that's around, I think.
It is,
too. Yeah. Also, though, that tenacity has come from, you were doing interesting original work, then you've got to have the same tenacity, it would seem to me, to get it out in the world, to find a publisher. Like Stone Weta, for example, that's published by a Canadian press. How do you kind of go about that process?
Well,
finding its home.
Mostly I work with small presses because, I haven't sold anything to one of the big publishers yet, though I would very much like to. But for me, I started out as a short story writer. I still think of myself primarily as a short story writer. I've had probably around 70 short stories published in pretty much most of the major science fiction markets. I've had multiple stories in at this point. And over the years, as you do that, you build up relationships with editors and with the other people being published in those markets, because you see you get your author copy of the magazine that you're in, and you read other people's work, and then you sort of
start to follow them
on social media, and you say, "Hey, I read your story; it was really fantastic." And that's how you sort of build relationships. And so when it comes to, I think, the
you create
Canadian
your tribe, basically, don't you?
Yeah, these are people that I know either first or second hand. And so that relationship has been built up. And Stelliform Press, which did the Impossible Resurrection of Grief and the short story collection, they are very focused on ecological and climate fiction. It's all they publish. And so when they started up, of course, I was aware of this because I was active in that area of, science fiction. And we're sort of aware of each other.
So you're doing the right match, which is always it's a fundamental kind of lesson, but some people haven't learned it yet, is that you've got to match your work with the appropriate publisher.
Yes, I have been an editor several times over the years. I think one is a horror anthology, and for the past several years I've been helping to edit a magazine on environmental justice writing. And probably at least 10 to 15% of everything we get in the slush pile is clearly from people who have never read the submission guidelines. The horror anthology that I edited, short stories about horror, and suddenly in my slush pilers, I know you say you want short stories about horror, but please look at my full-length memoir of online dating in Japan. That is a real example, by the way.
Oh, my Lord. Yeah, go on, talk about missing the mark.
Yeah, if you read the submission guidelines and follow them, you are, ahead of the bottom sort of 10 to 20% of submissions already.
And it's also just basic respect.
Yeah.
Isn't it? You don't go into a steak restaurant and start complaining about, why they aren't serving the courgette fritters or, sorry. I'm almost a vegetarian myself, but do you know what I mean? It's just, it's kind of, inappropriate. Octavia, I could chat on and on. We're getting a wee bit short of time, and so I'll need to wrap this up, but I do look forward to, there will be a Meet the Fellows function, I think. They usually have it at the Art Gallery. It's a bit of a panel, so if people want to come along to that, I don't know when it is yet, but I know they have it every year, and listen to you in person and meet you there, that would be great. I know that some other writers here in our lovely warm community have reached out to you for different things.
They have. It's been fantastic. Everyone's been really kind.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful.
Yeah, so more of us will get a chance to meet you in person. In terms of your work, I'll just do a quick précis. The Stone Weta, the novella You Are My Sunshine and Other Stories, and also you've got one story in a new sort of speculative fiction kind of anthology that's just recently come out on Amazon, called Artificial Sweetener: Tales of AI, 100% written by humans, and you've got a story in there.
And 100% written by New Zealanders. It's a New Zealand anthology. So.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So that's worth looking at for people too. But before we wrap up, I asked you what your favourite New Zealand music track was, and you've chosen one by Don McGlashan. That, pardon the pun, floats your boat. So can you tell us about why you've chosen the Greenpeace version of Anchor Me?
I have always loved this song. I love the original version, but the Greenpeace version really spoke to me. One of my recent projects was a novel about the Rainbow Warrior, which is out on submission now. And the Greenpeace version of Anchor Me was, I think, produced as a response to that. It was on one of the anniversaries or something, so I listened to it quite a lot when I was writing Ghost Rainbow.
Well, excellent. Let's all listen to it now. Thank you so much, Octavia. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and all the best for this year.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Here's the Greenpeace version of Anchor Me. And now a change of pace. Poets have always roamed the streets of Dunedin. Not for no reason do we have the Robbie Burns statue in our Octagon, or the fact that Thomas Bracken's poem became our national anthem. And the poetry community down here is still thriving, thanks in no small part to the efforts of the Octagon Poetry Collective, who have organised regular readings in Ōtepoti here for the last 40 years and are still going strong. So now I'm joined by one of the committee members, the current committee members for the Octagon Poetry Collective, my good friend and writing group buddy, Nicola Thorstensen. Welcome, Nicola.
Welcome, thank you.
So what we're going to talk about is the Octagon Poetry Collective, or the Octagon Collective it's sometimes known as, and really it's really wedded into the sort of social fabric of Dunedin, isn't it? Because it's been going for something like 40 years in a variety of venues.
Yes, the current iteration's been going for a few years, but looking back at the history, it's quite extraordinary, the continuity of poetry readings in the city and the number of people that have been involved in the organisation over the years.
And a lot of them now are household names, sort of definitely here in Dunedin and sort of nationwide as well. We're talking about people like Richard Reeves, Emma Neal, Peter Olds back in the day, John Gibb, Nick Ashworth, a lot of the women poets that somewhere in the history they were described as the sort of baby poets because they were fledgling back then, which seems incredible. I'm talking about people like Jenny Powell, Emma Neal, who I mentioned, Lindley Edmeads, Martha Morses, and the list just goes on and on. It's quite the who's who of the local poetry scene, isn't it?
That's right, and people like Diane Brown, Kay Mackenzie Cook, I guess the usual suspects, Carolyn McCurdy. It's more a question of who hasn't been involved, I think. Right,
yeah. So it started way back in the City Hotel in the early 80s, and that interested me because that was where my mother worked as a waitress when she was newly immigrated over here back in the 50s. So I love that link. Then it went on to other various sort of pubs and clubs, the Robbie Burns, Fuel Cafe, Arc Cafe for quite a while, quite successfully in the late 90s, then to the Crown Hotel. And then something really interesting happened is that the women sort of broke away and did their own group called Up Front, brilliant name. I think Jenny Powell came up with that name for a couple of years because I think they were a bit sick of as someone said in an article I read, the dark and dirty pubs starting very late in the evening, and also the odd bit of sexism and misogyny. So they kind of went over to one side and did some readings that were first at Martha Morse's house and then at Cobb & Co. And I'm not quite sure what happened, but I think we're all very pleased that it did, Nicola, is that they all came together again at Circadian Rhythm. And that's how I remember it, because that sort of chimes with when I moved to Dunedin. That was a lovely venue, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that was the same for me. I discovered it through my neighbour and went along to one of their readings, and it was a wonderfully
Your neighbour being Cade.
inclusive
Yeah.
space.
Mm.
And the cafe owners were very supportive of poetry and made us feel really welcome. So, they ran there for many years until the cafe shut down. And then I believe it was Emma Neal and others that found Dog with Two Tails Cafe as a receptive venue. That became our home for, again, quite some years until well through COVID, when sadly they shut down as well. And latterly we've been at the new Athenaeum Theatre, which is a marvellous venue where we've been made to feel very welcome, and it's working really well for us.
What works particularly well about the being in that theatre space, Nicola?
I think possibly the fact that it's a dedicated space. I mean, we're always welcome or happy to work around people, ordering cappuccinos and all of those kind of cafe-related sounds, but in the Nat, you don't have any of that. It's specifically set aside for the poetry, and it's set up kind of cafe style with tables at the front and then tiered seating further back, so people have got the choice of how close they want to be and how involved, and it can be a focused space where it's just about the poetry. Yeah,
you're right, because the cafe space, you've always got people barging through the door and the hiss and roar of the coffee machine and clinking of things at the bar, and it can be quite a noisy space, can't it? So
sure, and that was part of the vibe of it, and it certainly made it really colourful.
Yeah, very bohemian back in the day, wasn't it?
Sure. One of our visiting poets from Christchurch, when we first moved there, said, "Welcome to 1930s Berlin," and it kind of had a slightly similar vibe. It was quite dark, and the tables were set out in such a way that it did have that kind of appearance. But it feels really welcoming as a poetry venue, and I think it's working really well.
Now, just run us through the general format of an evening. What happens when? Right.
Well, we generally have our evenings on the second Wednesday of each month, so subject to things happening that mean that has to change. That's our general date, and we kick off at 7 o'clock. So there'll be somebody who's a designated MC for the evening, and they'll get there early and whiz around finding out who would like to read for the open mic, which is usually our first section in the evening. And so we'll tend to have a selection of open mic, and then we might have a short break followed by a featured reader, and we typically would have 2 of those during the evening. And then we'll tend to have a break and then introduce the second reader and possibly some more open mic and notices towards the end. It's not formulaic, but that's the sort of general idea of how we run the evening. And we try to be inclusive so that nobody's turned away from open mic, whether they're a former poet laureate or whether it's their first time reading. But we try to give first-time readers a special welcome and encourage them, because it is daunting to get up for the first time and bare your soul in public. So we try to be a supportive and inclusive space.
And I believe that, like with the open mic, you do have to limit it to sort of pretty much a poem a person, yeah? Otherwise it could kind of go on a bit.
That's right. It's always a little bit of a unknown quantity, because we don't know whether we're going to get a haiku or 3 pages, but we tend to say 1 poem per person unless they're very small. So if someone was getting up with a couple of limericks, that would be fine, but generally it's 1 poem. Otherwise, the evenings can spill out to be quite late, and we quite like the fact that they're not too late, being midweek, that they finish at a reasonable time.
Especially in the Dunedin winters. And also, talking about being inclusive, you as an ethos for the group, you sort of do have a kind of, I'm going to call it a code of conduct, sorry. That's not quite right, but that's not quite the right phrasing, but you are quite specific on sort of no hate speech and things, yeah?
That's right. So I think it's pretty self-evident that it's not appropriate to get up and scream abuse or anything too confronting, but we do try to recognise that people have different beliefs and different views, and that can be part of it, as long as it's done in a respectful way. We try not to be heavy-handed about it, but we want to keep the content manageable, really.
and supportive. Yeah. So, in terms of how people then might want to come along, can they just rock up, or how will they find out more about the collective?
Well, absolutely, they can just rock up 7 o'clock on the second Wednesday of, most months of the year. We don't typically run a January event, but we're there every other month. There's also information put up on our Facebook page, which is the Octagon Collective page, and that information's repeated on Instagram. We also advertise in print media and Radio 1. But if they want to go on our mailing list, they can just see one of the committee on the night, and we'll add them to that, and they'll get a mail out that tells them about 10 days out what's happening, and then sends a wee reminder.
I think you've got something like over 200 people on your email list, Nicola, haven't you? And between at least like 30 to 40, even up to 50 people come every month, don't they? So it's really well supported.
Yeah, we're really delighted how well it's gone since we moved to the Nat. I wasn't quite sure how it would be with a different venue, whether people would be receptive to it, but they've really embraced it. And that's right, we've got over 200 on the email list. Some are out of towners, so they'll only come if they can, but we get a very good core that tend to come each time, and then depending on who's featuring, we might get supporters of that person. So there's probably perhaps 20 to 30 that are reasonably much regulars, and then there'll be extras who might come just once or twice.
Yeah, who wash in and out depending.
Poets,
yeah, exactly.
Or they might get a taste of it and decide that they want to return. So, it can be quite big, but we haven't outgrown the venue. We're probably not quite at capacity, but we're getting really good crowds along.
Your next meeting, I see, because I know it off by heart because it chimes with when I do this show, which is also on the second Wednesday of every month. So mine's on at lunchtime and yours is on at 7 o'clock on the same night. That's the 9th of April. Do you know your guests for that yet?
At this stage, we have Jackson, who's a poet new to Ōtepoti. They just moved here in the last couple of months from Northland. And Sophia will be the MC. So at this stage, we'll probably only have the one feature, but we might sneak a second one in there yet to be confirmed.
Watch the space and keep an eye on the Facebook page. Thanks, Nicola. And I just want to round it out by saying people who do want to know the long, checkered and charming history of the Octagon Collective, they might want to go back and look online to a fantastic article that Caroline McCurdy wrote for the Down in Eden magazine. And I think that's still available online, isn't it?
Yes, it is. You can actually just Google Down in Eden, and they've got all of the back issues. It was a marvellous publication, and it's a really interesting article because it literally goes back to the year dot, pretty much the year dot for live poetry readings in Dunedin and all of the people that have been involved, which is, as you say, basically a who's who of local poetry.
Yeah, we've glossed over names, but they're there, aren't they?
You can download that article or just read it. It makes for very interesting reading.
And that is issue number 4 of the Down in Eden magazine, which, as Nicola said, is available online if you want to go into the very fascinating backstory. As I say, it really does sort of chime with being a social history of Dunedin through those times too, I think. Well, thanks, Nicola. Best of luck for your next meeting, and thanks for chatting with me today.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure. Cheers.
And following on from that interview, I want to give a heads up to another upcoming poetry event. Then it's not directly organised by the collective, but it certainly features many of their long-standing members. And that event is called Mountains We Climb. It's a special celebration of Brian Turner's work at Tuhura, Otago Museum on Wednesday the 16th of April. There'll be readings of Brian's work and an address by his good friend and mountaineer Philip Temple. So do make a diary note of that. And of course, the Fringe Festival kicks off this weekend, closely followed by the Dunedin Arts Festival. So that's 3 solid weeks of laugh, cry, uplifting, inspiring, surprising delights for you to enjoy. So please get off the couch and into the room and share those very human experiences. In terms of the Arts Festival, I'm ushering at quite a few events, and so I really would like you to come and say hello when you go to those. And that's our show. So my thanks to Octavia and Nicola and, of course, the University Bookshop for their ongoing support. So till next month, I wish you good reading, good writing. Goodbye.
What do you want to be when you grow up? They say you are what you read, and the University Bookshop can help you be whoever you want to be. Do you want to be an athlete? Then sit down with an inspiring sports biography. Do you fancy yourself as a detective? We have a grisly lineup of murder mysteries waiting just for you. Do you aspire to be the world's greatest chef? We have cookbooks to tantalise your taste buds. Do you want to celebrate your inner child? Play up in our fabulous children's room. The University Bookshop, helping you decide what you want to be when you grow up.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.